And we'll continue our exploration of the components of wine by looking at the aromatic elements. So just to kind of go back and look at the basic makeup again, if you remember, we've got water, which makes up the majority of what wine is. And then we've got structural components, and these actually make up probably almost all the rest of what wine is in terms of the amount of stuff, we'll say. However, we can look at aroma, and in some ways aroma has like the most impact, but it actually makes up a very, very tiny amount of the actual physical matter that's in wine. So we'll take a little bit of a look at it and see what it is that gives wine its aroma, its smell, and actually which makes it so distinctive. So in terms of like a general information about the aromatic elements of wine, and by the way, aromatic elements would be the ones that contribute to its smell. And if you tasted wine much, you know that the smell is actually quite important. And people will talk a lot about the smell of wine, the bouquet, the aroma, even like secondary and tertiary aromas as they develop as a wine aged. So, it's an important part of it. And what we find is that in terms of what makes wine smell like it does, there's actually hundreds of these aromatic compounds that exist in wine. But they're often very low concentration. In other words, there's not much stuff in there that actually smells, but we say it's odoractive, these compounds. And odoractive simply means that we can smell them. To give you an example, if you were to take, something like glass, for a piece of glass, and you were to smell it, if it was clean, it wouldn't smell like anything, so it's not odoractive. Whereas if you take like a piece of lemon rind and you smell it, it smells like lemon. So it has compounds in it that are very odoractive. So that's just kind of a little bit of a definition of what a smelly thing is. Really, we can say it's odoractive. Kind of a nice way of saying that. And sometimes we'll also find that people identify or at least categorize aromas in wine or odorants, as it's sometimes referred to, as either originating in the fruit, in which case it's sometimes called the aroma, or it originates from processing of the wine. So in other words, fermentation or barrel aging, for example, or even just as the wine ages in the bottle, it changes the aroma profile. And sometimes those processing odorants, again, we'll say are bouquet. You can see maybe just from this last few sentences that the term aroma as being something distinct in the wine originating in the fruit is actually kind of problematic, because aroma is such a generally used term to describe smell. So we'll tend not to do this, but sometimes it is useful to talk in these terms so that we can kind of separate out, like, what is the fruit originating odorants versus which ones are developed from fermentation. And the reason is that helps then guide the winemaker in terms of what to expect from the wine and how to make perhaps a certain style or to achieve a certain aroma profile, as we could say, in the wine itself. So there is usefulness in kind of looking at these things from these two different perspectives. But let's keep looking a little bit more about aroma. And we'll break it down into some kind of broad general categories. And by the way, we're going to scratch the surface of it. If you remember, there's like hundreds of these things. And we're going to look at just a few of them, but they're ones that are really important. And the first one we'll start off with is what we call them volatile acid, or VA. You might notice that as two perhaps distinct chemicals that we might be familiar with. One of them is vinegar, and the other one is nail polish remover, or in the case of what they compounds are, they're acetic acid, which is vinegar, or ethyl acetate, the nail polish remover. And basically, VA, as it's called, or volatile acidity, is a byproduct of basically fermentation and also oxygen contact with the wine. So we need two things for it to happen. One is ethanol, and or alcohol, and then that oxidizes into acetic acid and ethyl acetate. So what we're talking about here in we'll say extreme cases would be these are spoiled aromas. However, what we also find is that for many types of wine, especially red wines, that little bit of VA, the little bit of acetic acid smell, that very tiny amount of ethyl acetate actually enhances the aroma. So on the one hand, we've got a situation where in small quantities, VA, this combination of acetic acid and ethyl acetate, and by the way, they almost always go together in terms of what the aroma is. In small quantities, it's actually kind of desirable for certain styles of wine. In other situations where perhaps the concentration increases to a certain degree, we would say that the wine is flawed or even faulted. And the distinction there is that a flawed wine is one where you kind of go, well, this doesn't smell so good, but it's still drinkable. And a faulted wine is one in which you go, this wine doesn't smell good, I'll pass, thank you. So in other words, you don't want to drink it. And by the way, that's subjective, so what you may think of as being a flawed wine, someone else may go, oh, it's faulted, it's not drinkable, and vice versa. So be aware that there's also subjectiveness to this. But volatile acidity, or volatile acid, that combination of acetic acid and ethyl acetate, which is a result of basically poor winemaking or something close to that if it gets too high, is a pretty important part of the aroma profile of the wine. So we're kind of looking at some of the nasty things up front here, but that's okay. Because some of these, as I said, on one hand they're not good, on the other hand they are good, and we find aldehydes. So aldehydes are a very specific group of organic chemicals, and kind of typifying aldehydes would be kind of the rotten apple smell, and also typifying aldehydes is the smell of vanilla, so vanillins. So you can see that, aldehydes span a pretty wide range of aroma, some good, some bad. So a little hint of vanilla coming from usually oak aging in a wine often is seen as an acceptable trait and even desirable. So it adds interest to it. Likewise, a little bit of rotten apple, so that kind of aroma is probably not bad unless it gets too high, and then we would say that the wine is faulted or flawed. So again, it covers a wide range. Some is good, some is not good. But again, these compounds make up a lot of aroma that you find in different wines. Where do they come from? Well, in the case of rotten apple, it would be mishandling of the fruit because it is an oxidation problem, or rotten problem. So rotten apple describes rotten apples, and it's not too far off for grapes either. Vanillins, they're often sourced from oak. So different types of barrels have a lot of vanillins in them. And also the fruit itself will have different types of aldehydes that actually are desirable. Fermentation can also produce aldehydes. So in other words, the pathway in to the wine is pretty varied for each of these compounds. And depending on what it is and what the fruit is and how it's made will determine a lot about what this profile is. So the next group that we're looking at, again, these are organic chemicals, alcohols and terpenes. Some great names of things, and some really kind of interesting, very interesting types of compounds. Alcohols, we're talking about, yes, ethanol, but also different types of alcohols. And if we were to delve into the chemistry of this, we'd find that they'll have a similar molecular structure in some part, and that's what lets them be classified as an alcohol. We're not going to worry about that right now because it's not really important to what we're talking about. But let's look at what some of the aromas that can come from for these different types of compounds, alcohols and terpenes. And I have a couple of them listed here. So, for example, nerol is basically what rose smells like. So, if you have that compound nerol in your wine, maybe it originates in the fruit of that particular grape. Then you might smell the wine and go, oh, that's got a hint of rose to it, or a floral character. So, the concentration of each of these compounds affects the aroma in some way, and at the same time that concentration as it increases will be different than it is when it's at a lower concentration. So it's really important to kind of bear in mind that concentration is important as well as just its presence on its own. Another kind of interesting alcohol is terpineol, and it smells like camphor. So if you're familiar with that, it's a pretty strong odorant. Not something we'd want to find real strong in our wine, but maybe just a hint of it makes a red wine really interesting. So again, it's a concentration thing, like how strong is it, how much is in there, and that determines whether it's something that's desirable or not. As we go down through the list, another group would be limonene or citronella, and these are two very citrusy types of aromas. Citronella, I think we're familiar with from, mosquito candles. So, they don't like the smell of citronella and it keeps them away. So we get kind of that lemony orange, smoky smell that we get off a citronella candle. In wine, probably don't find it too much. This is more an example of, this particular group. But limonene actually does show up. And if you look at even the word itself, it kind of hints at lime and lemon. And yes, it does have a very lemon or lime-like smell, and it's one of the principal odorants that make up the very distinctive aroma of Gewürztraminer. So that kind of German-Italian grape, also grown in Alsace, France, as well as other parts in the East Coast and West Coast, but a very distinctive aroma. And it comes from, in part, limonene, and the other part of that, by the way, is linalool, which is another alcohol. And the combination of those two are almost entirely responsible for the very distinctive aroma of Gewürztraminer. So, these are, again, the alcohols and terpenes are very odor-active, often originating in the fruit itself, and are important in terms of defining characteristics for each variety of grape. Let's look at the next group, and these are esters. And these are ones that get a lot of press. And they're also quite interesting in that there's a lot of them. And some of them are actually kind of originate from fermentation. So the yeast in their metabolism release esters, and they help give some of the qualities, we can say at this point, maybe the bouquet, because it comes from processing, of certain varieties. And so, you can choose a yeast strain that actually has a lot of ester production, and it's intended then to produce fruitier smelling wines. Because if you look at, what esters tend to be, they're like artificial strawberry flavor is an ester. And so you can take a little bit of it and smell it, and it smells like strawberries. And esters are very odor active. So we're talking in terms of parts per billion or parts per million. So 1 molecule in a million and we can smell it. 1 molecule in a billion and we can smell it. Some aroma compounds, they measure in terms of parts per trillion. So that would be 1 molecule in a trillion hits our nose and we go, oh, I smell that. So, incredibly odor active in terms of how sensitive we are to some of these. So, yeah, these are artificial fruit flavorings at very low concentration. So we're talking, percentage-wise in wine, almost nothing, probably not even measurable parts per trillion. The other interesting thing about these, and this kind of lends itself to an explanation of why wines age as they do and the flavor improves, is that early on, they may be bound up with, chemically that is, with a sugar molecule. And so, because the sugar has this ester attached to it, it's not fermentable. The yeast can't break it apart and go after the sugar. And because the sugar molecule is tied in with this ester, then we can't smell it. It's not odor active in that form. But as the wine ages, conditions in there basically go through it, and this molecule gets broken apart, and now we have sugar and we have ester. Now, the sugar is not in a high enough concentration for us to be able to detect as sweetness, and in fact, it's not even high enough in concentration that the yeast can find it and ferment it. So it's just kind of part then of the wine, kind of the unfermentable sugars that tend to show up in wines. The ester, on the other hand, because they're so odor active, is noticeable, and we get bouquet forming then in this way as these esters are broken away from their sugar counterparts. And so this is part of wine aging. And the other part about this is that there are enzymes, and so again, not to get too deeply into the chemistry, but enzymes are basically chemicals that act as catalysts for the breakdown of other chemicals. And we can add a chemical, this enzyme, to our wine that actually goes in and breaks apart these molecules, then frees up these esters early on, and so we can enhance the varietal character early in a wine by adding these types of enzymes. And we'll talk about them a little bit later when we get more into that. But right now I just want to kind of stick with the idea of aroma and where it comes from. So esters are an important part of it. We're talking about some other compounds here that have both positive characteristics and negative, and for the most part sulfur compounds tend to be negative, even if they're part of the fruit and desirable to a certain degree. And the first group that I have here are the methoxypyrazines, and so pyrazine indicates that it's a sulfur compound, and essentially what we have here is a group of chemicals that have kind of the distinct aroma of green pepper or bell pepper or something along those lines. If you're familiar with Sauvignon Blanc from, for example, especially New Zealand, then you know that it tends to have that kind of grassy, almost kind of venturing into bell pepper, but also kind of that grapefruity character. And these are what the methoxypyrazines are. And if you have a Cabernet Sauvignon that is from a cool region, so for example, a lot of the eastern United States, they tend also to have this kind of very distinctive bell pepper aroma. And these come from methoxypyrazines. They're typical of the Bordeaux fruit, so those Bordeaux varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, Carmenere, they all tend to have this as part of their varietal makeup and kind of varietal signature, we can say. As the fruit ripens, by the way, the methoxypyrazine concentration drops, and so that's why we find unripe Bordeaux varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon kind of typifies this, and Cabernet Franc especially, they tend to be more bell pepper-like in the aroma. As they get riper, and we find this in warmer climates, then the shift happens from kind of that grape or vegetative bell pepper aroma into more of the kind of the blackberry and black currant aromas. And so this is the importance of ripening, by the way, in terms of changing those chemical makeup. So methoxypyrazines, a sulfur compound, and to a certain degree they are what define the Bordeaux varieties, so we can't say that they're bad, but when they become too prevalent and they kind of stand out above anything else, then we would say that the wine is perhaps flawed or even faulted at that point. So methoxypyrazines, yes, varietal character on the one hand, a flaw if the concentration is too high, indicating unripe fruit, and a fault if it's really high, again from unripe fruit. And speaking of flaws and faults, the next ones, we call them reduced sulfur compounds. These are almost entirely off odors, faults, flaws. And the first one is rotten egg, which is simply hydrogen sulfide. So it's a very simple molecule, and it stinks. It's very odor active, so we're talking in terms of parts per billion for it to be detected. And it smells like rotten egg. And I think most of us at least know what it smells like. And I don't, perhaps we have never smelled a rotten egg, but we know what the smell of reduced sulfur is. If reduced sulfur in the form of hydrogen sulfide reacts with alcohol, such as in wine, it can form a skunky character. So mercaptans smell like skunk. They also smell like natural gas because they add a mercaptan to the gas so that it has odor, because otherwise it's odorless. So we go from rotten egg to skunk, and from skunky we go into burnt rubber, and these are disulfides. And so disulfides, basically, if you were to take two mercaptans and link them together chemically, you've got a disulfide. And some of the typical disulfide aromas would be burnt rubber, as I have here, but also like cauliflower or cabbagey, and some of these show up in wine as well. Again, it's a concentration thing, so very low quantities, and they have a lot of aroma to them. For the most part, a winemaker who has somewhat of a reasonable skill can deal with these very quickly, efficiently, get them out of there and take care of it. If they're not taken care of right away, then we do find that they go into the disulfide form, which is, it's a bigger molecule, it's harder to get rid of, and it's harder, therefore, to clean up. So recognizing what hydrogen sulfide smells like upfront lets you correct the problem very quickly, and then you can get rid of it, so it doesn't get any worse than that. So kind of on the other side of the flip side, we'll say, from reduced sulfur is sulfur dioxide. And if you notice, it has oxide in the name, which means it has oxygen attached to it. So reduced sulfur basically means that the sulfur content does not have oxygen, and it has a different valence to it. In other words, it has a minus sign, we'll say, instead of the plus sign, and sulfur dioxide is just the opposite. And what happens then is sulfur dioxide is actually used as a preservative in wine. It's known as a sulfite, as opposed to the reduced sulfur, which is a sulfide with a D. So sulfites are used as a preservative. It's SO2 is another word for it. And basically it's a very simple chemical. It does have odor, but more importantly, it also is very irritating to our nose. And so when we smell a wine that's high in sulfur dioxide, it actually kind of irritates our nose, tickles it, makes us want to sneeze. And so perhaps not so much a odor as just an irritant, a nasal irritant when we inhale it. But it's still important in that way. So we have to be careful about how much we add. If it's in excess, then it becomes a problem. So that kind of is a real quick run through of different odorants in wine. One that perhaps I didn't mention was alcohol. Just ethanol itself has some odor, although it's fairly light, and probably is in the background of most of the other odorants for wine. But you can see that hopefully that there's a lot of different things in there from very different sources, and these are what make wine smells like what wine is. And so that's kind of the importance of this lesson. We'll pick up and continue and talk about balance, which really just refers to how do all of these components that we've talked about come together to make what we understand as wine.